December 20th, 1941. Coming China. 18,000 feet above the Yunnan Plateau. The clouds break apart like torn cotton, and through the gaps, the green earth of southern China stretches endlessly beneath a pale winter sun. Squadron leader Robert Jack Newkirk leans forward in his cockpit, his leather gloves wrapped tight around the stick of his Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk. The engine, a single Allison V17, 10 liquid-cooled inline, growls steadily at cruise power, vibrating through the aluminum skin of the airframe and into his spine. He can feel every rivet, every imperfection in the metal. This is not a Spitfire. This is not a thoroughbred, and he knows it. Beneath the nose of his fighter, a row of jagged white teeth have been painted over the chin, mounted radiator scoop, the now iconic shark mouth, borrowed from the Royal Air Force's No. WW2 squadron in North Africa and adopted by the American Volunteer Group, the unit the press will soon call the Flying Tigers. The paint is crude. The airplane is, by most contemporary assessments, already obsolete. The P-40B lacks a supercharger capable of delivering competitive performance above 15,000 feet. Its rate of climb is sluggish. Its maneuverability at low speed is nothing to celebrate. On paper, the Nakajima Ki-27 and Ki-43 fighters it's about to face can turn inside it, outclimb it, and stay with it in a rolling scissors until its pilot runs out of ideas. But Jack Newkirk is not fighting on paper. Below and to the southeast, 10 Japanese bombers, Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily light bombers, are droning toward Kunming in a loose formation, escorted by a screen of Ki-27 fighters. They've come from Japanese-occupied French Indochina, and they expect no resistance. For months, the skies over free China have belonged to Japan. The Chinese Air Force, once hopeful, has been ground to almost nothing. There are no modern interceptors here, no radar network, no organized fighter defense. Or so the Japanese believe. Newkirk pushes the nose over, his wingmen follow. 4 P-40Bs in the first element, diving out of the sun in a steep slashing attack, exactly as their commander, Claire Lee Chennault, has drilled into them for months. Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps captain turned aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, has studied Japanese tactics with a fanatical intensity that borders on obsession. He has watched their fighters. He has timed their rates of climb and turn. He has identified their weaknesses, fragile airframes with no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, engines that cannot sustain negative G maneuvers without starving for fuel. And he has built an entire tactical doctrine around one simple, brutal truth. You do not dogfight the Japanese. You do not turn with them. You dive, you shoot, you break away, and you climb back to altitude to do it again. The P-40 is perfect for this. Not despite its limitations, but because of them. At 350 miles per hour in a dive, the Tomahawk is rock solid. Its controls stiffen but remain responsive. Its heavy airframe, the same mass that makes it sluggish in a climb, gives it energy retention that lighter Japanese fighters cannot match. And its armament, 250 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the nose and 430 caliber wing guns, delivers a concentrated burst of fire that can shred a Ki-27 in a single pass. Newkirk opens fire at 300 yards. The tracers arc out in a bright stream and walk across the fuselage of a Ki-27 escort. The Japanese fighter doesn't burn. It disintegrates. Pieces of wing and canopy tumble away into the white void below. Newkirk pulls up hard. The G forces pressing him into his seat, blood draining from his vision, and rolls away to the right, refusing to slow down refusing to stay in the fight. Behind him, his wingmen make their own passes. 2 bombers are hit. One trails, thick black smoke, and begins to descend in a slow spiral. The entire engagement lasts less than 4 minutes. When the Flying Tigers land back at Kunming, they count the score. The AVG and Chinese interceptors have destroyed at least 4 Japanese aircraft. Some accounts will say more, without losing a single P-40. The city below is untouched. The bombers have scattered, and for the first time in years, the skies over China have been successfully defended. It is only the 3rd day of combat operations for the American volunteer group, and already a pattern is emerging. A pattern that will challenge everything the aviation world thinks it knows about what makes a great fighter airplane. Because the Curtiss P-40, by every metric that matters to engineers and procurement boards, is an inferior machine. It cannot compete with the Messerschmitt Bf1 09F at altitude. It cannot out-turn a Zero. It cannot outclimb a Spitfire. In the great hierarchy of World War II fighters, it sits somewhere in the middle, a workmanlike design descended from the radial engine Curtiss P-36 Hawk, updated with an inline Allison engine and little else. It is, in the words of one aviation historian, a compromise that satisfied no one, and yet here it is, fighting, winning, holding the line in a theater where nothing else is available, where the supply chains are stretched to the breaking point, where the Allies are reeling from catastrophe after catastrophe. Pearl Harbor was 13 days ago. The Philippines are under siege. Wake Island has just fallen. Malaya is collapsing. Hong Kong will surrender in 5 days. The entire Western Pacific is in flames, and the Japanese military machine appears unstoppable. But over Kunming, a handful of American volunteers in shark-mouthed P-40s have just proven that it can be stopped, if you know how. This is the story of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the fighter that was never the best at anything, but was there when it mattered most. The airplane that bought the Allies time they desperately needed. In every major theater of the Second World War, flown by pilots who learned to turn its weaknesses into strengths. It is one of the most produced, most widely deployed, and most consequential Allied fighters of the conflict. And yet, 8 decades later, it remains one of the least celebrated. It's time to change that. To understand why the P-40 was both everywhere and underappreciated, you have to go back to the late 1930s, to a moment when the United States Army Air Corps was desperately trying to modernize, and the Curtiss Wright Corporation was desperately trying to stay relevant. In 1937, Curtiss was still one of the largest aircraft manufacturers in America, but its glory days were fading. The company that had once been synonymous with American aviation, founded on the legacy of Glenn Curtiss himself, the man who had rivaled the Wright brothers, was watching younger, hungrier competitors pull ahead. Republic, North American, Lockheed, these firms were designing sleek, innovative airframes that pointed toward the future. Curtiss, by contrast, was leaning on what it knew, and what it knew was the P-36 Hawk. The P-36 was a perfectly competent radial engine monoplane fighter. It had won the Army Air Corps fighter competition in 1937, beating out the Seversky P-35, and entered service as the front-line pursuit aircraft of the United States. It was maneuverable, pleasant to fly, and sturdy. It was also, by 1938, already falling behind the pace of European fighter development. The Messerschmitt Bf 10 9 had debuted in the Spanish Civil War and demonstrated performance figures that the P-36 simply could not match. The writing was on the wall. Radial engines were reaching their limits in fighter applications, and the future belonged to liquid-cooled inline power plants that offered lower drag and higher speed. Curtiss chief engineer Donovan Berlin understood this. Rather than design an entirely new aircraft, a process that would take years and cost millions, the company didn't want to spend. Berlin proposed something faster and cheaper. Take the existing P-36 airframe, already proven and already in production, and replace its Pratt & Whitney R-18 30 twin Wasp radial engine with the new Allison V-17 10 liquid-cooled V-12. The result would be a fighter that was faster, more streamlined, and, crucially, available almost immediately. It was an elegant solution. It was also, in the long run, the source of almost every limitation the P-40 would carry throughout its career. The prototype, designated XP-40, first flew on October 14, 1938, at Buffalo, New York. Test pilot Edward Elliott took the modified P-36 airframe into the sky over Lake Erie and found what the engineers had predicted. The Allison engine, producing 1,040 horsepower, gave the aircraft a top speed of approximately 342 miles per hour, a significant improvement over the P-36, 300 miles per hour. The aircraft handled well at medium and low altitudes. It was fast in a dive. It was stable as a gun platform. But there were problems. The Allison V-17 10, for all its smoothness and reliability, lacked something critical: an effective two-stage supercharger. The engine breathed well at sea level and performed adequately up to about 12,000 feet. But above 15,000 feet, its power fell off dramatically. In an era when aerial combat was increasingly being fought at 20,000 feet and above, particularly in the European theater, this was a crippling deficiency. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane used a sophisticated two-speed supercharger that maintained power output at high altitude. The Daimler-Benz DB601 in the Bf-109 had similar capability. The Allison, by contrast, was essentially a low-altitude engine, and no amount of airframe refinement could change that fundamental fact. Curtiss engineers knew this. The Army Air Corps knew this. Everyone knew this. But in 1939, with war consuming Europe and the United States scrambling to rearm, there was no time to wait for a perfect engine. The P-40 was available now. It could be produced on existing tooling. It could be delivered in quantity. And in a world where the alternative was flying biplanes and obsolescent P-35s, good enough now trumped perfect later. In April 1939, the Army Air Corps placed an initial order for 520 P-40s, the largest single fighter order in American history at that time. Curtiss, Wright's massive factory complex in Buffalo, New York, began tooling up for mass production. The assembly lines that had built P-36 Hawks were retooled, and the first production P-40s began rolling out in 1940. They arrived not a moment too soon. But not for America. Not yet. France, staring down the growing might of the Luftwaffe, had placed urgent orders for the export version of the P-40, designated the Hawk 81A. When France fell in June 1940, before most of those aircraft could be delivered, the orders were transferred to Great Britain. The Royal Air Force, hemorrhaging fighters during the Battle of Britain and desperate for anything with wings and guns, accepted the American fighters and designated them Tomahawk. RAF assessments were blunt. The Tomahawk was tough. It was fast at low altitude. Its 50 caliber machine guns hit hard. But it could not compete with the BF 109F above 15,000 feet, and its rate of climb was inadequate for the kind of high-altitude interception work required over southern England. The RAF made a pragmatic decision. The Tomahawk would not defend Britain. Instead, it would be sent, where its strengths could be exploited, to the western desert of North Africa. It was a decision that would define the P-40's legacy. The North African theater was, in many ways, the perfect environment for the Curtiss fighter. Combat took place primarily at low and medium altitudes, below 15,000 feet, where the Allison engine was at its most competitive. The desert landscape was flat and featureless, favoring the kind of high-speed, slashing hit and run tactics that played to the P-40's strengths. And the aircraft's rugged construction, its ability to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed more delicate airframes, proved invaluable in the harsh conditions of sand, heat, and rough field operations. Number 112 Squadron, Royal Air Force, was among the first units to take the Tomahawk into combat over the western desert, and it was here that the iconic shark mouth nose art first appeared on P-40s, inspired by similar markings on German Bf 110s. The image was more than decoration. It became a symbol, a statement that this blunt, unglamorous fighter was something to be feared, regardless of what the specification sheet said. By mid-1941, P-40 Tomahawks and the improved Kitty Hawk variants were flying with multiple RAF, South African, and Australian squadrons across North Africa. They tangled daily with BF 109Es and 109Fs of the Luftwaffe, as well as Italian Macchi Seaplane 202 Folgores, both of which were superior in climb rate and high-altitude performance. The P-40 pilots learned, adapted, and survived. They learned never to engage in a climbing fight. They learned to use the P-40's superior dive speed to disengage when things turned bad. They learned that the aircraft's 650 caliber machine guns, introduced on the P-40 Kitty Hawk, could saw a BF 109's wing off in a 2-second burst if you got close enough. They also learned something else, something that doesn't appear in any flight manual or performance chart. They learned that the P-40 could take punishment that would have been fatal to almost any other single-engine fighter in the war. Pilots returned to base with holes in their wings, large enough to put a fist through. They landed with shattered canopies, severed control cables jury-rigged in flight, and coolant streaming from punctured radiators. The airframe was tough in a way that inspired a peculiar kind of loyalty, the loyalty a soldier feels for a weapon that is not elegant, but is absolutely reliable. Australian ace Clive Killer Caldwell, who would become the top Allied ace in North Africa, with 20.5 victories, the majority scored in P-40 Tomahawks and Kitty Hawks, put it simply. The P-40 would not outperform its opponents in any single category, but it would bring you home. And in the western desert, where a forced landing in no man's land could mean death by thirst or capture, that mattered more than any stat on a comparison chart. While the P-40 was proving itself in the sands of Libya and Egypt, a retired American air officer on the other side of the world was about to demonstrate just how lethal this second-rate fighter could be if you threw away the rule book and fought on your own terms. His name was Claire Lee Chennault, and his Flying Tigers were about to become legends. Claire Lee Chennault was, by temperament and conviction, the perfect man to unlock the P-40's potential. A former Army Air Corps pursuit instructor who had been forced into medical retirement in 1937 due to chronic bronchitis and partial deafness. Chennault had spent years arguing, loudly, abrasively, and to anyone who would listen, that the prevailing doctrine of high-altitude bomber invincibility was dangerously wrong. He believed in fighters, he believed in tactics, and he believed that a well-flown inferior airplane, piloted by a disciplined aviator who understood the geometry of aerial combat, could destroy a superior one. When Madame Chiang Kai-shek invited him to China in 1937 to survey the Chinese Air Force, Chennault found his proving ground. And when he was authorized in 1941 to recruit American military pilots and ground crew for a covert volunteer fighter group, what would officially become the first American volunteer group, he finally had his instrument. The aircraft he was given to work with was the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, a batch of 100 fighters, originally destined for the United Kingdom and diverted to China through a labyrinth of diplomatic back channels and presidential directives. Chennault did not waste a single day. At a dusty training base in Tunggu, Burma, in the sweltering months before Pearl Harbor, he drilled his pilots relentlessly on two principles. First, never dogfight a Japanese fighter. The Ki-27 and the A6M0 were lighter, more nimble, and could sustain tighter turns than the P-40 at virtually any speed. A turning engagement was suicide. Second, always fight from a position of energy advantage. Dive from altitude. Fire in short, accurate bursts. Break away before the enemy can react. Use the P-40's superior dive speed and structural resilience to escape the engagement envelope. Climb back to altitude. Reset. Do it again. It was not romantic. It was not glamorous. It was systematic killing, built around an honest assessment of what the P-40 could and could not do. And it worked with devastating effectiveness. Between December 20th, 1941 and July 4th, 1942, a period of just over 6 months, the American volunteer group was credited with the destruction of 297 Japanese aircraft, against the loss of just 14 pilots killed in aerial combat. The ratio is staggering. It remains one of the most lopsided combat records of the entire war. And it was achieved entirely with the Curtiss P-40, the airplane that specification charts said couldn't compete. But the Flying Tigers, for all their legend, represent only one chapter of the P-40's war. And to understand why this aircraft deserves to be remembered as one of the most important Allied fighters of the Second World War, you have to pull back from Kunming and look at the full scope of its service, because no other Allied fighter of its generation fought in as many places, against as many enemies, in as many desperate circumstances. In the Soviet Union, over 2,000 P-40s were delivered through Lend-Lease, arriving at the port of Arkhangelsk and through the Persian Corridor. Soviet pilots flew the P-40E and later P-40K and P-40M variants on the Eastern Front, where the low-altitude nature of combat, tactical air support, ground attack, and fighter sweeps below 12,000 feet once again played to the aircraft's strengths. The Soviets appreciated the P-40's heavy armament and robust airframe, though they found its climb rate inferior to the Yakovlev Yok-1 and later Yok-7. Several Soviet aces scored kills in P-40s, and the aircraft served in frontline units through 1943 before being gradually replaced by indigenous designs and Bell P-39 Airacobras. in the Southwest Pacific. P-40 Airs and P-40 ANs flew with the Royal Australian Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces in the desperate air battles over New Guinea, one of the most grueling air campaigns of the entire war. Here the P-40 faced the Mitsubishi A6M0 at its peak, flown by experienced, battle-hardened Japanese naval aviators who had been conquering the Pacific since December 7th. The conditions were brutal: tropical heat-warped airframes and sapped engine power. Humidity corroded electronics. Runways were carved from jungle mud and coral. Spare parts were a luxury. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, sometimes 3 or 4, in temperatures that turned cockpits into ovens. And still the P-40 held. Over Port Moresby, over Milne Bay, over the Owen Stanley Range, P-40 pilots, many of them young Australians with barely 200 hours of flight time, fought the Zero to a standstill. They did it the Chennault way, whether they knew his name or not. They dove. They fired. They broke away. They refused to turn fight. And they exploited one advantage the Zero could never answer. The P-40 could absorb hits that tore the Zero apart. A single incendiary round in a Zero's unprotected wing tank could turn it into a fireball. A P-40 could take a dozen hits and keep flying. In the Darwinian calculus of aerial combat, survivability was its own form of superiority. Squadron leader Keith Bluey Truscott of No. 76 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, became one of Australia's most celebrated aces flying P-40s over New Guinea. His story, like so many P-40 pilots, is one of grinding attrition rather than soaring triumph, of day after day flying a fighter that was never quite good enough on paper against an enemy that was, on paper, better in almost every way, and yet winning. Winning because the airplane was there, because it was tough, because it could be maintained in conditions that would have grounded more sophisticated machines, and because it could be flown aggressively by pilots who understood its soul. This is the truth that the post-war mythology of World War II aviation has consistently overlooked. The story of air combat in the Second World War is usually told through its stars: the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Thunderbolt, the Zero, the Bf-109. These are the aircraft that grace magazine covers and museum centerpieces. They are the thoroughbreds, the revolutionary designs, the game changers, and they deserve their fame. But fame and importance are not the same thing. The P-51 Mustang is rightly celebrated as perhaps the finest piston engine fighter ever built. But the P-51B didn't enter combat in significant numbers until early 1944. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a magnificent fighter bomber, didn't see widespread service until mid-1943. The Spitfire, for all its brilliance, was produced primarily for the defense of Britain and was never available in sufficient numbers for global deployment in the war's early years. The P-40 was there in 1940. It was there in 1941. It was there in 1942 and 1943, the years that mattered most. The years when the Allies were on the defensive. The years when the outcome of the war was genuinely in doubt. It fought in North Africa when Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened to seize the Suez Canal and cut Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East. It fought over China when the entire Chinese war effort hung by a thread. It fought over Darwin when Australia itself was under direct air attack. It fought over the Aleutian Islands in the frozen fog of the North Pacific. It fought in Sicily, in Italy, in the China, Burma, India theater. It fought on the Eastern Front in the defense of Moscow and Stalingrad. Over 13,738 P-40s were built between 1939 and November 1944, when the last P-40N-40 rolled off the Curtiss Wright assembly line in Buffalo. By that time, the aircraft was genuinely obsolete, outperformed by the latest marks of every major fighter in the war. Curtiss Wright itself would never recover. The company that had been America's largest aircraft manufacturer at the start of the war failed to produce a successful successor to the P-40. The XP-46, intended as a replacement, was cancelled. The P-60 program went through endless revisions and never entered production. By war's end, Curtiss was finished as a major aircraft builder, overtaken by the very companies, North American, Republic, Lockheed, whose designs had eclipsed the Warhawk, and so the P-40 faded from memory. It became a footnote. The shark mouth-nose art endured as a cultural icon, but the airplane behind it became a curiosity. The fighter people recognized but couldn't quite name. The one that wasn't a Mustang, wasn't a Spitfire, wasn't a Zero. It was the reliable tool you forget about once the job is done. But imagine the war without it. Imagine North Africa in 1940, one with no low-altitude fighter capable of challenging the Bf-109. Imagine China with no air defense at all. Imagine Port Moresby falling, because there were no fighters available to defend it, because the Spitfires were in England and the Mustangs hadn't been built yet. Imagine the months between Pearl Harbor and Midway, when American forces were reeling across the Pacific, without the one fighter that could be shipped anywhere, assembled in primitive conditions, maintained with limited tools, and thrown into combat against the best the Axis had to offer. The P-40 did not win the war. No single weapon system did. But it held the door open. It bought time, weeks, months, entire years of time, for the arsenal of democracy to spin up, for the great factories of Detroit and Long Island and Los Angeles to begin pouring out the Mustangs and Thunderbolts and Hellcats and Corsairs that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers. It was the fighter that was never the best. It was the fighter that was always there. And that, in the end, may be the most important thing a weapon of war can be. The next time you see a photograph of a P-40 Warhawk, shark mouth snarling, olive drab paint faded and chipped, sitting on some dusty airfield at the edge of the world, remember what it represents. Not perfection, not innovation, not the cutting edge of aeronautical engineering. Something rarer, something harder, sufficiency, reliability, presence. The Curtiss P-40 was the fighter that showed up. And in the darkest years of the Second World War, showing up was everything. But here's a question worth thinking about. If the P-40 held the line when nothing else could, what other aircraft from World War II have been forgotten the same way? What other machines fought in the shadows, did the dirty work, and never got the credit they deserved? We're going to find out. This channel, WW2, Forgotten 45, is dedicated to uncovering the stories that history left behind. The weapons, the battles, the people that made all the difference, but never made the headlines. So if this story surprised you, if it made you see the P-40 differently, then you're going to want to be here for what comes next. Because the next forgotten story might change the way you see the entire war. Subscribe now, and don't miss it.